This episode of The Unstarving Musician is sponsored by Liner Notes. Learn from the hundreds of musicians and industry pros I've spoken with for The Unstarving Musician on topics such as marketing, songwriting, touring, sync licensing, and much more. Sign up for Liner Notes. Liner Notes is an email newsletter from yours truly in which I share some of the best knowledge gems garnered from the many conversations featured on The Unstarving Musician. You'll also be privy to the latest podcast episodes and Liner Notes subscriber exclusives. Sign up at unstarvingmusician.com. It's free and you can unsubscribe at any time. This is The Unstarving Musician. I'm Rabanzo. This is my podcast. It features conversations with independent music artists and industry professionals with occasional special topic episodes featuring yours truly. A glimpse into the minds of my varied guests, all intended to help independent music artists better understand the marketing, business, and creative processes that empower us to do more of what we love. Make music. Welcome to another episode. How are you? Where are you? What are you wearing? These are the things I wonder when I imagine you listening to the podcast. Whatever the situation, I hope it's good. Hope you're feeling confident with what you're wearing. You ever wear stuff that makes you feel less confident? You should try that stoic thing where you just say, is this the worst thing that can happen to me? I've actually tried that. It works pretty good. I have some gigs coming up I want to share with you in case you're in Querétaro, Mexico. And in one case, in case you've got spare cash today as you're listening to this and want to come see me play Friday the 13th with blues ensemble Lluvia Azul at Moser Café Culture. If you can't come today, you can come October 28th, which is a Saturday. I'll be with my own Rabanzo Lalo Trio. That's a new thing I got going, singing lead vocals. I will be at Chez Moi on the 28th of October. And then I've got a house concert on Day of the Dead, which is the 2nd of November, here in Querétaro in the Centro Histórico. That'll be a fun show. You can get an invitation to that through my website. Then I get to play the Querétaro Blues Festival with Johnny Bergen, who's coming to town. That'll be on the 4th of November. That's going to be amazing. Then another house concert in San Miguel de Allende, a Pueblo Mágico in our area, a very popular artsy town in the area. That'll be on the 7th of November. And then I will be with another new project, Rabanzo's Undercover Blues, back at Moser Café Culture on Thursday, the 9th of November. You can see all these events, their details, and future events at rabanzo.com. That website, by the way, my website is on Bandzoogle, my artist website. And I mention that to say thank you to Bandzoogle and those of you who use the Unstarving Musician discount code to try it out. It helps support this podcast, and you probably need a Bandzoogle account anyway. You probably need a website. Well, hopefully you have a website, but maybe you want to make it better. My music website is there, as I said, and they really have everything you need to promote and sell your music. Keep your fans and supporters informed. You can sell merch on a Bandzoogle site. They have EPK templates, crowdfunding templates, email and social features for staying connected with your fans and followers. All that stuff is built in to their website. It's super easy. It's one of the websites I own that I don't ever have to worry about. Almost never. But seriously, the level of worry is way lower because they just take care of everything. So if you haven't looked at it yet, please visit bandzoogle.com and use the promo code ROBONZO, ROBONZO, to get 15% off your first year. So my guest is Susan Rogers, who teaches music production and engineering for the Berklee College of Music as part of Berklee Online. She holds a doctorate in psychology from McGill University, where she studied music cognition and psychoacoustics. That is the name of a band, psychoacoustics, should be. Her research focuses on auditory memory, the perception of musical signals, and the influence of musical training on auditory development. For 2 decades prior to her science career, Susan Rogers was one of the world's few women known for her work as a recording engineer. All right, let's go backwards. Producer, engineer, mixer, and audio electronics technician. Her career highlights include, get this, staff engineer for the recording artist Prince. That was from 83 to 88. And working with Barenaked Ladies, David Byrne, Tricky, and Tevin Campbell. So I became aware of her because one of the team members here at the Unstarving Musician sent me an NPR interview with Susan in which she talks about her book, This Is What It Sounds Like. After learning about the book and her career, I reached out. She graciously accepted, and we had a really interesting conversation. My research for the interview involved checking out some of Susan's other interviews, and I noticed that she had talked a lot about Prince in those other interviews. And so leading up to mine, I figured she's probably talked about the guy ad nauseum. And I thought, I'm not going to ask her a bunch of Prince questions, maybe one. I got to think of the one question. But then I realized she actually loves talking about this era of her career. As you can imagine, she feels super lucky to have been part of it, and she wants to help keep his legacy alive. But even so, I didn't want to focus entirely on Prince. But I did plan the one question, and we do talk about it. Apparently it was a good one that she doesn't get all the time, maybe hasn't gotten before. At least that's the way it came across when she responded. And so we do talk about Prince, and we talk about the neuroscience of music preferences, analyzing the techniques of Frank Sinatra, the progression of production techniques, leaving the music business for academia, working with Barenaked Ladies, how music functions for listeners today, and what musicians can take away from her book. All this stuff is super interesting. I think we can learn a lot from it. And we talk about a whole lot more, and I mean a whole lot more. Learn more about Susan's book, Dr. Susan Rogers' book, This Is What It Sounds Like, at thisiswhatitsoundslike.com. All right, here is me speaking with Susan Rogers. So thank you for spending time with me today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, my pleasure. Are you based near Berklee?
No, I was at Berklee for 15 years, and then I semi-retired. Now I live in the Hudson River Valley in upstate New York, and I teach for Berklee Online.
Oh, nice. Do you have ties to that area, Hudson River Valley? Is that what it's called? So I know of it. I don't know much about it, but
yeah, I don't have any ties here at all. Just when I was thinking about retirement, I wanted to be close, kind of, to the big city, to New York or to Boston, but I definitely wanted the country, and it is really beautiful here. Really beautiful. It attracts so many artists. You can see why.
Oh, cool. I know so little about it, but I know of it, and I guess the name sort of gives it away too. It's a beautiful place. By the way, congrats on your new-ish book. This Is What It Sounds Like, What the Music You Love Says About You.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are you still talking? Do you still have, it seems that you are now. I didn't look at dates on all the things that I was reading and looking at, but they all felt very recent. Are you still finding opportunities to talk about it in forums like this or like NPR, like we'd recently heard you on?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, and I'm really glad about that. So I have speaking engagements this fall. I just said yes yesterday to a couple more in the wintertime. And I probably do an interview or a podcast still at this rate. I'm doing about 2 a week.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I always say yes because I love the subject so damn much. You know, I've been working in music my whole adult life in one way or another, and it never gets tiresome talking about it. It just never does.
Well, in reading and listening to some of your interviews, it shows that you still have a great passion for it. And in fact, when you came on my radar and I'm learning about you, my initial thought was, boy, she's probably talked about Prince ad nauseum. But when I listen to stuff that I don't believe is very old, there's still a lot of, seems to be a lot of fond memory and just general enjoyment with talking about it with people.
Yeah. In fact, Monday night, I was live on the radio at the BBC, myself and 3 other guests talking about our experiences with Prince. And the host kept saying, oh, if only we had more than an hour. It's true. Those of us who were so privileged as to get to spend time with someone who's truly one of the more unique musical minds of the last century, those of us who spent time with him we experienced something really extraordinary. In Prince's own words, like those kinds of cars don't pass you every day. And of course, you work with other musicians who will knock your socks off, but Prince was a one of a kind, that's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. And I think as I've listened to and again read about some of the things that you've said about your time with him, I'm reminded, yeah, that, I mean, how can you not look back on those times with a lot of fascination and some fondness and just, memories that really hang with you. I wanted to
Yeah.
start by asking you about some songs that you reference in your book, just to hear what I have read you literally came on my radar just a day or so before I reached out to you, and thank you again for agreeing to speak with me. So I'm learning about your book. I had an opportunity thus far to read the introductory section of it and some interview things that you've done. But I was looking at the website, which I should go ahead and say, this is what it sounds like.com, which is kind of cool. Some of the things that you have on there, including a list of songs that are referenced in the book. And I don't know if this is too many to ask you about. I was going to ask you, I think, about 3 here, and maybe there's a ton to say about them. I'm not sure. But one of them caught my eye because I've looked at it as one of my favorite recordings of all times. And it happens to be from one of my favorite, if not favorite bands of all time, the Rolling Stones. But you have Jumpin' Jack Flash on the list. Also, I tried to branch out and listen to some things I wasn't so familiar with, like Seven Rings by Ariana Grande, Taki Taki. That one was by DJ someone whose name is not in front of me, but it features Selena Gomez, Ozuna, and Cardi B, and you can refresh my name as to the DJ. And then the last one, Talking Loud and Saying Nothing by James Brown. And if that's a lot to try and respond to, you could just pick a song and talk about how you relate them to the theme of the book.
Oh, yes. So there are, I believe, 132 different records that are referenced in this book. And sometimes people have mistakenly assumed that these are my favorite records. And I did not do that at all. I didn't want to write a book about my taste in music. What I wanted to do is write about the listener's experience and share my experience as a non-musician, as a music lover throughout my whole life, and as a record maker, and as someone who has earned a PhD in studying the brain as it processes music. So it's all about music listening. And in order to do that, you have to reference music that might not be the street you live on, but might be the street that someone else lives on, a variety of music. I set a goal for myself, though, to only reference a record and talk about a record that I could at the very least get. Meaning, sometimes you listen to a record and you try to imagine what the record makers were thinking, and you think to yourself, I don't know what this is all about. I don't feel connected to it at all. But other times you listen to a record and you think to yourself, yeah, it might not be my favorite style of music, but I get where they're going with this, and I admire this, that, or the other thing about it. So those 4 records and all the records in the book do on some level connect with me. But I was hoping that, that there'd be enough variety in the book that everybody would feel at least once that a record represented them. As for the 4 that you just mentioned, well, of course, I love the Rolling Stones. I love the Rolling Stones. And Jumpin' Jack Flash, I mean, what a guitar riff. I just had to, I had to throw something out there for the Rolling Stones because I connect with them more deeply personally than I do the Beatles. And it's going to be harder for me to talk with passion and understanding about the Beatles than it is the Rolling Stones. That's a dilemma that all of us have if we're going to write a book about music.
Sure. Well, and I was happy to see you reference 2 of the Stones songs in the short list that I was looking at on your website, which discusses referencing these songs. But yeah, great, good songs. I mean, these recordings, the few that I listened to are all interesting recordings in their own way. And yeah, I'll have to check out some of the other ones. I don't know if it was, I listened to lots of things about music, so I found myself this week listening to things I've never listened to before, kind of in the pop and rock genre, but it's still always fun to discover something new. And you gave me a little opportunity to do that just when I was browsing your website. Let me skip to the one Prince question I'm going to ask. I think everyone's asked her everything about him, and there's probably much more to tell, but I was just curious because I lost track of his history in terms of recording, and in going through some of your interviews, something surfaced for me, and I started looking for this album called the Black Album, and I'm like, oh, what is up with this record? And then I was like, oh, this is the one I believe that she mentions that he had decided that this album was evil, I think is the way you'd put it. And what struck me was when I was kind of looking around for it in the usual places that we find music these days, I couldn't really find it. Although I did find it looked like individuals, and maybe the estate has done the same, or some other organization that kind of puts music out. But I did find it on YouTube, and I just would be interested to hear what your memories are of what the deal was with that record. If you can just guess what I'm saying or what I'm asking here.
Yeah, it's a very good question, or a very good topic that I don't get asked about very often. So bear with me if I get a little bit long-winded, but this is what happened with that. So we were making the Sign of the Times album, which is regarded by many critics as being a masterpiece. And it was happening at a time in Prince's life where he was just about to turn 30, or he just did turn 30. And it was also 1987, which meant that music was changing pretty rapidly, because at this point it became abundantly clear that rap and hip hop would be the dominant style of music for a good long run, and that funk music was the kind of stuff that Prince did a lot. He didn't do it exclusively, but his style of music was fading out. So Prince was in a kind of a kind of vulnerable position in his career. He needed to make a change, and he needed to do it the right way. But he went ahead and he did Sign of the Times, and under this cloud of pressure. And then in December, this would have been December of 86, he decided to take just a little pause from making the Sign of the Times album and just have some fun, because Sign of the Times was kind of a heavy record for him. So let's just have some fun. And we spent a few days in the recording studio just doing dance tracks, Le Grind and Cindy C and Rock Hard in a Funky Place, just dance tracks. The reason was that it was going to be Sheila E.'s birthday, and Prince liked to have his own dance music to dance to at parties. So what we would do is we would record these dance tracks. You could take them in Los Angeles, you could take them down the street to Grundman Mastering, and Bernie Grundman would press up acetates for you. You give the acetates to the DJ at the club, the DJ can play them, and off you go. You're dancing at the club. So we did a batch of songs in December, and then set them aside, didn't think about it anymore. Sign of the Times came out in 87, and Prince was very disappointed in the response from Black radio. He didn't get the airplay on Black radio that he was used to. They played Adore, and I think sometimes they played Sign of the Times, but he gets some criticism there for having lost his funkiness. And so he had a knee-jerk response, and he thought to himself, they don't think I'm funky? I'll show them who's funky. And he cobbled together all those tracks we had done for Sheila's party. He included one or two new tracks, called it the Black Album. No artwork or anything like that, just like the Beatles' White Album. This was the Black Album, and was going to release it. And the album was printed on vinyl. It was, as I heard the story, it was on the loading docks, ready to go off into the trucks for distribution into record stores, when Prince decided, what am I doing? I've never made a reactionary record before. All the albums I've released up to this point have been planned. This is stupid. And he pulled that record off of the loading dock and decided to do something else. He ultimately did the Love Sexy album. That was often attributed to Prince's feeling like the Black Album was evil. That might be an overstatement. He was going through a rough time. And one thing I can say with some certainty is that he thought that record represented not his best stuff. not his most thoughtful artistry. I think that was the main reason it was pulled.
Well, I am personally looking forward to listening to more of it. I listened to a small amount of it, and I was like, this is really good stuff. And I haven't gone back to listen to Sign of the Times either. And again, I kind of lost track of where he was going, probably around the time he did Sign of the Times, which I guess is perhaps could be seen as the pinnacle of his career. But I certainly remember that track, that title track. And I just want to go back and listen to it. And the other thing that happened to me, and maybe a lot of others who were Prince fans of my ilk and didn't follow him with the fervor that others did, is when he was distributing, his music. And I don't even know, I'm sure you can tell me, but I don't even know if Sign of the Times was part of this. But when streaming and all these things started, it seems like he had made the decision, and correct me if I'm wrong, to distribute his music himself. And so it just wasn't available unless you just went a little bit out of the way. It didn't take much, I don't think, because he was certainly, seems like in retrospect, and even when I realized what he'd been doing for a number of years, that he was selling quite well and doing quite well. But I just missed out on a lot. So I'm looking forward to going back and listening to them. And I don't know if you care to comment or correct me on any of the things I just said about, what he was doing in terms of distribution. But please, if you do.
Yeah, I don't know too much about it because I was no longer with him at that time period. But I do know that through the 90s, he went through a really rough phase with his record labels contractually. He just didn't feel like he wanted to be under contract anymore. I did hear the story about, I think the year was around 2002 when he released an album, and this was something. In 2002, you just didn't do this. But what he did was he included a CD copy of his new album in the London Sunday Times, in the newspaper. So when people went to their door on Sunday morning and got that newspaper, the new Prince album was in it. And of course, his record label was just infuriated. He gave this record away for free. There might have been millions of copies that he distributed. But Prince was ahead of his time in recognizing that in the future, music won't be sold necessarily as much as it will be shared and distributed. It will consist of, there'll be this vast pool of musical signals, and we just avail ourselves of whatever we can. So he was ahead of the curve in figuring out new ways to distribute his music. And that involved fighting with his label, and no doubt it involved lawsuits and things like that. I heard stories from folks who were his employees in the early 2000s and late 90s of being with Prince at Paisley Park, and literally Prince and the others just putting records into boxes and attaching labels on the top to send them out to people.
That's so interesting and amazing.
Yeah. He was brilliant, and he could foresee a lot of the trends that were coming, despite not being an entrepreneur or a businessman. He could figure out the pattern of how things go, and he foresaw what streaming would do to music years before it actually happened.
Probably part of his living and breathing exercise of living music. Let's talk for a moment about listening habits, as I'll label them, but and I'm going to start by sharing mine and just get your take on it, or my tendencies. I talk to a lot of songwriters on the podcast, and I talk to a lot of musicians about music, their songs, other people's music, and invariably, I think that's the right word, but we will get to talking about lyrics and how lyrics grab this person. And I've admitted so many times, and it took me a good while to realize this, and I've been married for a number of years, and my wife has always been someone who lyrics can make or break a song for her, and I think a lot of people are like that. My listening habit or tendency, on the other hand, is I am really drawn to melody of, it can be instrumentation, melodic instrumentation. It can be vocal melody. And I can have a favorite song for many months, maybe even years, and not be able to sing a word other than part of the chorus before and only more recently have I begun to listen to lyrics more attentively to try and appreciate them. But I don't think they still don't come close to what I feel from hearing melody and certain types of instrumentation. Do you discuss that kind of thing at all in the book?
Yes, I definitely do. And the running theme in the book is the individualization of our listening brain. So everything is the way it is because it got that way. And that means that when we were really young, little kids, we would be exposed to music on the radio and music in our environment. And sometimes we'd be exposed to music during a really happy time in our life. And every now and then, a given record would just strike your little brain and body as being just perfect, just sublime. Now, what's happening when we listen, we've got our two ears on the left and right side of our heads, and the signal is coming up this dual path, the auditory nerve bundle. And once it comes up the path and it reaches the brain, it splits off, and a record is analyzed in various regions of the brain. So for nearly all of us, that melody and that harmony is going to be analyzed over there in the right hemisphere. And for most of us, lyrics are analyzed, processed, enjoyed in the left hemisphere, the homologous region. So split off left and right, because the left hemisphere processes words, speech for most of us. Then our frontal regions can be processing the style on a record. The motor cortex up above can be processing the groove on that record. So what that means is, as you listen to a record, you can rove your spotlight of attention around all that record's features, listening for a treat. And a treat is where you experience just a little bit of a release of dopamine. It just feels good. So when your listening brain listened to records, as soon as it found a melody that it liked, it said, sweet. And some dopamine was released, and you kept that spotlight of attention close right there on that melody. Or it might have been the rhythm or something else. For other people, they don't get that dopamine release until they hear that lyric that just solves a problem for them, or makes it all perfectly clear, or strikes them as beautiful poetry. And then they get that dopamine release. So that trains our brain to listen for the features that we know are most likely to please us. Now, this doesn't mean that those of us who love rhythm, I'm one of them, don't also listen to the lyrics. I do, but it's not the first place my brain is going to go when it listens to a record.
It's just a reminder of how incredibly complex our brains are, and super interesting. What do you make of people who appear to lack appreciation for music? And I don't know if you're going to tell me they don't exist, but I swear I've met a few in my life. And I think something's wrong with you.
Yeah, it's very, very true. And I do make a point of repeating in the book over and over, never be a music snob, because, although we're tempted to be one, because music functions differently for different people, just as food and clothing do. Some of us really couldn't care less about what we order from a menu. Other people are totally fussy about it. There's no right or wrong or good or bad. It's just how you are. So yeah, there are a couple of reasons, or even three reasons, why a person might not be engaged with music very much. One is, I think, the one you're most familiar with, which is tone deafness. People who have tone deafness are missing some connectivity in the brain, such that they don't process melodies the same way most of us do, and they actually have a hard time memorizing melody. So music is unlikely to give them a lot of joy. They're going to have a hard time singing along, and they're going to feel a little bit embarrassed sometimes in the conversation, because they simply don't have the response to music that others do. And that might be due to tone deafness. There's also something called beat deafness, which is another set of circuits in the brain that prevent the extraction of rhythm from a record. Now, extracting rhythm from a record is something we start doing that when we're toddlers. Little toddlers will bounce up and down and try to dance along with music. But for people who are missing some of these connections, it's a little bit like being dyslexic. And the same signal that the rest of us process easily, for them, it's a little bit harder. Then there's a condition that's actually more common, and that's musical anhedonia. People who have musical anhedonia do not get pleasure from music listening. They get pleasure from the things like food and sex and recreational drugs, the other things that can release dopamine, but they don't get the dopamine release to music. So when they say, I'm just not that into it, it doesn't mean that they're not hip or that they're not trying or that they're trying to be a contrarian. They're telling the truth. They're just simply not pleased, shall we say, by music.
It certainly makes me look. It kind of broadens my scope of people who have a lack of music appreciation a little bit. Like maybe I know more of them than I realize, and I realize also that my phrasing of it is not really accurate, but super interesting the way that you describe it.
Yeah, and Roberto, this is something I've been thinking about lately because it's dawned on me so slowly. But the truth is, if we, and by we, I mean the musical community, if we're being honest, we have to recognize there are a lot of people who really aren't that into music. They like it well enough. And they'll be those people, you probably met them years ago, who would have maybe, I don't know, half a dozen albums in their collection. And that's going to be quite different from people who have walls of vinyl. So there are folks who genuinely like music. They genuinely like it, but they don't like it enough I'm going to use a phrase that I think your listeners will understand, to build their world around it. Like for those of us who work in music, it feels necessary. It feels like an integral part of our lives. It's part of our self-identity. We judge ourselves and we judge others partly through a musical filter. That's how important it is to us. But there are many people who like music well enough. They listen to the radio a lot and they go to concerts, but they don't like it that much. It's a continuum, music appreciation.
All right. It's good to know. I'm so glad I asked about it. What can musicians, songwriters, and maybe just, the musician who's a player learn from the themes in your book? Maybe some of the things we've already talked about.
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked because teaching students at Berklee, I teach in the music production and engineering department, they're contemplating a life in music, making a living doing this. And one of the first things they need to know is you can never please everybody. So don't try. Find your audience. Find, first off, your listener profile. Find out what you respond to in music, the rhythms, the lyrics, the styles, the performance gestures. Be able to be in touch with that deep listening that you do to music and be able to talk about and shape the music that you make based on where you get your dopamine release, based on what makes you happy. And then after you've done that, try to understand your listeners, your audience, and recognize that they're coming there to see you or to hear your record for some of those same treats. They like the meal that you are serving them, and be okay with accepting that there'll be a lot of people who just don't get you musically. Let them go. It's fine. It's fine. They've got their artists and you've got your audience.
I love that. And it ties in nicely with some commonly given advice in this crowded space of music, if you're trying to share your music, that and I mean, frankly, it's just marketing advice too, is to look for your tribe, look for your niche, look for people who are into you and what you do. And
yeah. And for that reason, it's important to recognize who your competition is. If you're Marcus King, your competition is going to be different than if you're Sudan Archives. Who else is adding their brick of music to the wall that is that subgenre? Who will you be compared to? You're contributing, just as you do if you're a scientist. You're contributing your art to part of this giant structure that is the musical building. So who else is doing what you're doing? That's really important. Now, a lot of young artists, they don't want to compare themselves to anybody else. And sometimes a naive way of putting it is saying, well, I don't really sound like anybody else. Yeah, you do. Yeah, you do, because you're a human being, and human beings are influenced by other human beings. So accept that, embrace it, and recognize that you've got nothing to lose here. You can't help yourself. You're going to make a unique statement. You will. So don't be afraid of comparing yourself to others.
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that and the importance of it. It's a recurring theme on the podcast with among musicians about being compared and being genrefied, and some are embracing of it. Some have a difficult time, as you give an example of, in expressing, who they may sound like. And I've only published a couple of songs, original songs, but in sharing those and thinking about them and listening to feedback, I always try to just respond with, well, these are the influences I definitely tried to bring into it, and then these are what people have told me about them, some of which was a surprise. And I think it's that way for everyone. Always a little surprise in that question.
Yeah, there always is. Yeah.
Speaking of Berklee and your teaching, what drove your decision to leave the music business to pursue a career in academics?
The same reason that I pursued the sciences was the reason that I pursued music in the first place. It just feels like a calling. Down deep inside, I felt like I just have to, one way or another, I have to be there where music is being made. I want to be in the recording studio. If there's any way I can do this, I just felt that drive. And I started in 1978. You didn't see women engineers and producers back then. You didn't even hear of any. But I started my career as a technician, and Prince hired me as his tech and moved me into the engineering chair, and found out in the fullness of time that, yeah, there were a lot of men who wanted to work with me, and women too. So that calling was dominant up until I started reaching my early 40s, and I began hearing a second calling, which was a calling to pursue the sciences. It just felt like, oh, I've just got to do this. I just got to do this. There's I'm not thinking about it rationally. I don't have any scientists in my family. I have no idea what that life is going to be like, but I just felt like I have to do this. And I listened to that voice and I did it. I had a hit record with Barenaked Ladies with that royalty money like you'd get back in the 90s. I was able to leave the music business and start a whole new career exploring the brain and music.
You're somewhat of a trailblazer in that regard for women, I would say, as you mentioned in 78, or when you started your path in music. And not a lot of women were doing it. And it struck me as I started learning about your career as a producer that the same held true. I wonder, of course, if it was holding true at all when you were entering the sciences, and I don't really know, and maybe you want to comment on that. But first, I want to read something that I read about you this morning. I really loved it, and I think it speaks to the core of who you are, and maybe even kind of helps define your really interesting career. Let's see, so I got some snippets here, so forgive me. I have a couple things that aren't complete sentences, but University of Sound and Arts, right in the crossroads of the world in Hollywood. They had teachers from Wally Heider Sound, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing, Sunset Sound, and Capitol Studios. My friend said, this is you talking, I'm going to go to this school and become an engineer. And I believe your thoughts are, there was no way I had money for that, but my friend was able to get me a job as a night receptionist at the school. I couldn't afford the classes, but I could afford the books. And there's a little more after that, but amazing, first of all. And I know you're not the only person to have done something like this, and certainly not the only woman to have ever done something like this, but I still think it's a bit rare, and I wonder if it's a type of thing that happened throughout your career.
Yeah, I do remember that, and I wished so badly that I had, this is 1978, that I had $3,000 for this course at the University of Sound Arts, which was a one-room schoolhouse in Hollywood, but I couldn't afford $3,000. But I could afford the textbooks, and so I did. I just bought modern recording techniques, and Don and Carolyn Bayer had a book on acoustics, and I would go to op-amp technical books in Hollywood, and I would buy the audiobooks and read and study on my own, just trying so hard to be useful, to arm myself with enough knowledge and eventually a skill that would allow me to be of some use to music makers who are bringing the thing that I loved into the world. I didn't think about the oddity of being female in this profoundly male-dominated profession, because I kind of figured, like, well, what the hell? I'm doing the same job they're doing. Why would being female be a problem? It didn't really occur to me. And that's probably why I did all right. I had the confidence of not even recognizing that there was an issue there, which was good.
Indeed. It strikes me metaphorically that you used books to kick some doors in for your career, maybe throughout, and maybe this was just like the way it started off, and then a little bit of luck and a lot of determination and some good relationships were the result of the rest.
In the beginning of the book, this is what it sounds like. I quoted at the very beginning of the book, I quoted the late, great Sam Phillips, who's one of my idols. He's the man who discovered Johnny Cash and Elvis Presley and B.B. King and all these great artists. Anyway, he said, that feeling, it's the greatest feeling in the world, that I'm a part of this somehow. That was all I ever wanted, is just let me be a part of this somehow, not as a player or writer or singer, performer. Don't put me on stage. No one wants to see that. What I wanted was to be a part of and contribute to the people who are on stage, who are in front of the microphone, who are writing songs. That's been my greatest desire in my life.
Yes, I recall reading something to that effect, and it's beautiful. On teaching production at Berklee, I did want to ask you how changes and or progression in production, how they sit with you, both like technologically and artistically over the years, and maybe in some other facet.
Great question. Technically and artistically, I'm all for it. What the youth of today are doing musically, it's intriguing and it's exciting. And I wish I had the tools that they have now. I wish I had it when I was their age. And what these young people are doing with distortion, and what they're doing with the unwanted parts of sound that we used to have to work really hard to clean up, they're actually making art with it. So I think technology and music are in a really good place right now. The only thing that, well, there's several things, but this is the main thing that I'm struggling to understand, and I haven't wrapped my head around it, is how music functions for listeners today. So I understand music makers, they haven't changed that much. They still want to do their thing, and you listeners haven't changed that much. We still crave rhythm and melody and lyrics and vocals and all that, but modern music today seems to be designed or optimized for being ignored, for listening through headphones, for listening while you're doing something else. And that wasn't the case when I was young. With vinyl, of course, you sit in front of the stereo speakers and you listen to the music, and you read the album cover, and you're a captive audience. You're an active listener. I still haven't quite figured out how the rapid acceleration and prominence of passive, non-attentive listening is going to change music. I have a hunch, but I don't have enough insight to know for sure.
Yeah, that fact does make me a little sad, but it's something I've seen happening for a number of years, if for no other reason, by virtue of the amounts of entertainment we have at our fingertips.
I know.
Even before the iPhone came around, there were just explosions of different types of entertainment, and the attention spans get kind of crowded.
And that I'm such an optimist. And they did say at one point, they said, well, television is over. Television is becoming a dying art form. And then along came The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. And I think they call it the second golden age of television. And it's back. It's back. So sometimes when we write off an art form, we have to be careful because we forget that technology changes really fast. Styles of making art changes really fast, but the human brain changes very slowly. And what the brain liked tens of thousands of years ago, it still likes today. It needs food and shelter and sex, and it needs diversion and a
Drugs and
social
rock and
life.
roll.
Right. It needs all that. And so we're not going to stop craving music. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I have a listener question I need to make sure I squeeze in here, but so in an NPR interview that I think I listened to as well, you discuss the singing techniques of Frank Sinatra, and a listener wanted to know how you go about researching something like that, where you analyze the techniques of a singer like that.
Oh, well, in the Frank Sinatra case, I read the incredibly wonderful two-part biography by James Kaplan. James Kaplan, that's Kaplan, wrote this two-part extensively researched biography of Frank Sinatra, and he quoted from a lot of the musicians who worked with him and knew him, and they talked about how Frank was just such a maestro of melodic phrasing. That's one way. But the other way is to just listen to the man and listen to the band and listen to where Frank puts his phrases in relation to the band. And if you really listen deeply to that, it will wipe you out. I'm talking about Frank at the height of his prowess, in the 60s and 70s. In the book, I write about the song, It Was a Very Good Year, which was recorded with the Count Basie Orchestra in Las Vegas, led by 26-year-old band leader Quincy Jones. Anyway, listen to Frank and where he's timing those phrases. And sometimes he can be out in front of the band, and sometimes he lets the band take it first. Then he comes in his own sweet time. And then listen. He takes an inhale, like every singer must, to deliver a line. But just when you think that line is going to end, Frank just keeps on going. And he'll go right over the bar, and he will deliver this subtext that says, I have more power than you. Other guys who are out there listening, I've got more power. That's a very subtle suggestion that he is more virile. And it's a suggestion to women and to men as well. So Frank learned how to do this really early in his career, and he became a maestro of phrasing and timing.
I recall you maybe in the same interview, or I'd read it, that he learned circular breathing, and that I don't know if you definitively attributed his abilities for these super long phrasings to that. But I was very interested by that.
Yeah, he did a lot of things, and all of this was described in the James Kaplan book. So when Frank was young and living in New York, by young, I mean 24 years old, he was taking vocal lessons from a teacher named John Quinlan. And right around this same time, he went to Carnegie Hall and he saw the violinist Jascha Heifetz playing, and Frank was sitting up near the front, and Frank saw how Heifetz would reintroduce energy into his bowing technique without lifting the bow up off the strings. He was performing this, so he had these long phrases going on the violin. And Frank thought to himself, I need to learn how to do that with my voice, how to keep a phrase going after you think I've run out of air. So Quinlan helped teach him how to do that. And then for a time, Frank gave up smoking. That didn't last very long because he was back at it. But for a time, he gave up smoking, and he was swimming a lot and also running because he was trying to increase his lung capacity. The musicians that Kaplan talks about in this book say that it was rumored that Frank had an extra rib, because he could inhale and hold on to this full tank of air longer than most singers could.
Sounds like an amazing biography. I'll have to check that out. And
Oh, so good.
I love how we attribute some unusual anatomical feature to people who do and sing. I'm thinking of another singer, Freddie Mercury. Something unusual about the way their face or their next to rib or something, because it's just not possible that a normal person could do it,
Right.
even though it may be true. But yeah, wow, sounds
Yeah.
like he was really.
Humans love applying causality. It comforts us. And a few years back, I was giving a talk. I was in Kentucky. I was giving a talk to Prince fans, really hardcore Prince fans. And they had brought me there to tell Prince stories. And I was only happy to. So, sure, why not? So I was telling Prince stories. And there was a woman there near the front of the audience. And she kind of laughed and she said, "Stop, stop, stop." I said, "What's going on?" She said, "You're making him sound too human." And she was laughing and kind of waving her hands like, "Stop, stop." And I said, "Why is that a bad thing?" And she said, "I don't want to think of him as human. He is a superhuman to me." And I said, "Wouldn't it be even more exciting to realize that the guy who accomplished all this was a mere mortal, just like the rest of us? Isn't it more exciting to think that this is what a human is capable of?" But for this woman, and maybe for some other people too, they would rather think, no, 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 no. This is something extra. This is something extra special. I don't know. I guess there's all sorts of ways of thinking about phenomena in the world, and we choose a way that makes sense to us.
Yeah. I mean, clearly there were some special things about him, but I heard something long ago that made me. I've repeated it to a lot of people whenever I hear that. Oh, what a prodigy! What a genius! What a superhuman! And I'm reminded because of something I heard that. But yeah, they worked really hard. They worked
Yeah.
really hard to get there.
No kidding. Yeah, exactly. Now that I have neuroscience training, I can identify some regions of the brain that I suspect were abnormally developed in Prince's case. And that sounds bad. So let me go ahead and put a finer point on it. One of them is a region in the right side of our brains, kind of near the back, a little structure called the precuneus, and it's involved in creativity. People who are what we call hyper creative have an abnormally functioning precuneus. The precuneus is normally a little gate for creative ideas, and it helps us. That little gate helps us separate relevant from irrelevant information. It helps us move from original thought, which I like to label art, to craft, our skill. You think of something, you think of a song, you write the song. You think of a part, you play the part. You're constantly going back and forth between art and craft. For people who've got kind of a faulty break in their precuneus, their ideas just keep coming and coming and coming and coming. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not skilled craftspeople. It means, like Prince, they just can't stop creating. And that's why our sessions would be 24 hours long, and you'd sleep for 4 hours and you go around again. So there was that precuneus. Also, I know of, not directly, but indirectly, I know that when Prince was a child, he experienced epileptic seizures, and he grew out of them. But the epileptic seizures tend to originate.
Susan, you still with me?
Yeah, I'm still there.
Uh-oh. Hey, bear with me just a second if you can hear me. That was my fault. Are you there?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. Continue,
Oh,
please.
anyway, I was saying that the precuneus is one region of the brain, and there's another region that is implicated in epileptic seizures, and it's also implicated in music processing. I wouldn't say implicated, I would say it is involved in music processing. When someone experiences abnormal activity in this region, they might, as Prince did when he was a child, have epileptic seizures, or they might just be especially sensitive to music. So I have a couple of hunches about ways in which Prince's brain might have been a little bit different than most people's, but that's it.
And you talk about this. I want to mention it, and I apologize. I had inadvertently muted you so I couldn't hear you, but I think you were still coming through. But I wanted to mention for listeners, and I'll put a link in the show notes, an interview that you did, a podcast or YouTube channel called Sunset Sound Recorders, where you tell some really wonderful stories about your work with Prince. And the two gentlemen that were on the podcast with you had some nice stories too, but you talk about hypercreativity. And somehow I'm not surprised to hear you talk about it in this manner with the kind of abnormality in the brain, because you certainly, you listen to a story of someone like Prince and you're like, yeah, why are they so different? There's something, why they are wired just a little bit differently, clearly. So it's fascinating to hear the theory that you have going for it.
We are all, I shouldn't even use the word abnormal. It would be better to say atypical,
Sure.
because we've got 89 some odd billion neurons up there. And you think about the number of possible combinations of those neurons. You can't think about it because it's an unimaginable number, which means, and this is good, we are truly unique individuals. We're the product of our unique experiences and our unique innate wiring, as well as the wiring that happens with experiences. I believe I said earlier in our talk that everything influences you, and so everything is the way it is because it got that way. And each one of us has a brain that got to be a certain way over our lifetimes.
And it is so interesting. I want to ask you one more question about your career in music, and then kind of wrap up, and hopefully you're okay on time, I hope.
Yes.
You mentioned it a little while ago, the work you did for Barenaked Ladies, Stunt Album is the name of it. Is that right?
Yes.
It's has always struck me as a remarkable sounding album. Now, and I don't say that as like I'm a huge Barenaked Ladies fan, although I do like a lot of their music. I never even bought anything by these guys, but every time I heard some of the tracks, and one in particular, probably the more popular one on there, it really struck me as just sonically incredible. And the band clearly had a lot to do with that as well. And I think what I'm calling remarkable is special given when it was released as well, and what else, the other things that were going on at the time. Can you share your memories of working on that? And I'm assuming you share at least some of my sentiment, given that it's your work, but anything you can attribute to why it was what it was.
Thanks for that. I like the sounds that I get. I like, after a certain point, after learning how to be competent in the studio, I had my drum sounds and my piano sounds and my guitar sounds and bass sounds and vocal sounds, and I liked them. When you're in the studio, you're employing a running stream of decision making. Your brain is constantly moving a microphone or changing an amp setting, and you're constantly thinking to yourself, no, 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 until you turn that dial and suddenly you say, yes, now that's what I'm talking about. And that's why I said earlier, music makers should be well in touch with their own listener profile, because the more you know what it is you like, the faster you're going to be able to get to it. So yeah, by the time I worked with Barenaked Ladies, I had a notion of the sounds that I liked. But as you mentioned a moment ago, a lot of it is attributed to the band. Really great players like these guys are, they pick up their instrument and they get those instruments to produce an optimal tone. I see it at Berklee all the time with these beginning musicians. Well, they're not ranked beginners, they're more like intermediates, but they still haven't learned how to physically interact with their instrument in such a way that that tone just knocks you off your feet. The more experienced musicians who tour a lot, they do this so naturally and so well. So the sounds you hear are part the musicianship, and then part the ear of the engineer, and then of course there's the ear of the mixer. So everything just kind of comes together to make this composite and the choices on a record. That record was so fantastic because we only had 3 weeks. I rather only had 3 weeks with them. I had another record booked right before it and right after it. So I had 3 weeks to spend. And the guys said, well, we've got songs ready. So, do you think we could go in the studio and just knock out a batch of songs, 15 or so in that time, and do some vocals and stuff? And I said, yeah, let's do it. And what we don't finish, we'll pass off to another producer, David Leonard, and David will finish the overdubs and do the mixing. So that's how we did it. We went down to Arlen Studios in Austin, Texas, and for 3 weeks we worked really hard, and had a great time. Looking back on it, it was bittersweet because Kevin Hearn at that time was really struggling to eat and struggling to sleep, and he wasn't feeling well. We found out at the end of that record he was finally diagnosed with leukemia. And he made it. He's fine today. But wow, when I think back of that record, we made a record with a guy who had leukemia, or hadn't been diagnosed yet, but was struggling to figure out what was wrong with him. At the same time, we're working with these guys who have just finally figured out what it's going to take to be together as a band, and how their direction is how their new direction is going to progress, and all of that. These young men were able to handle because of their high native intelligence, their high maturity, and just being really great guys.
Wow, and I didn't know that side story there. So it's interesting, but yeah, great work. And it's nice to hear that they were on fire in your eyes too. I couldn't imagine it any other way.
If there happen to be women listening to this and they're thinking, is there a place for me? Can I get in the music business? Will I be accepted? I got to say, 22 years of being in the studio, pretty much very close to every single day. The men that I worked with, it was mostly men, although I did some work with women, but mostly men. The men I worked with were accepting and respectful, and I had a great time with them, a really great time, including these guys.
That's beautiful. Do you have an ongoing relationship, working, friendship, or otherwise, like in contact with your co-author and Ogi Ogas? Is that how you say his name?
Yeah, it's Ogi. He approached me in 2019 because he was a professional co-author. He finds scientists or people who are doing something interesting, and he asked them, would you like to write a book? And he asked me if I'd like to write a book about music. And I said, well, I can't, because my students know more about music than I do. Well, what I can write about is music listening. That's where I have expertise. So we agreed, and it ended up being really wonderful because Ogi had at that time anyway, almost no knowledge of music whatsoever. And he's one of those people who rarely listens to it. I mean, liked it well enough, but really didn't have much of an interest in it. And in our partnership, I found I had to explain just the basics of music to Ogi. Things like rhythm. It just seems so obvious, to people who work in music. But for someone who doesn't know what it is, you have to say, here's how this works. Here's what this is. Here's what to listen for. So the coupling, we could not have been more opposite musically. And our partnership was good for that reason. So he taught me how to write a book, and I taught him about music. And together we reached the finish line.
That's nice. That's so interesting. He has a great name, but yeah, I'll take a moment to pause next time I encounter someone who's doing something where I have that moment where I think, but you don't know anything about that. there may be something they know that works out. That's so interesting. Okay, yeah. Last couple questions for you, and I'll let you go. What does the future of music look like in your eyes?
I think it's clear that we are now in an era of timbral manipulation. So rhythm has been area of interest all through the hip hop rap era. Prior to that, lyric writing and protest songs and expressing political views and things like that in North American music. I know the rest of the world it's not quite the same, but here the lyrics went through their developmental phase, in the 60s and 70s, and prior to that it was the golden era of melody. But now we're in timbre because we have the tools that can blend reality with artificiality so beautifully. So just like you can watch a TV show with, I don't know, dragons or zombies and stuff like that, things that don't physically exist, they can be made to look as though they do exist and they are integrated into the real world. And likewise, now we are manipulating sounds in such a way that you've never seen that instrument before. That sound that you heard, you've never seen the instrument that makes it, because the instrument that makes it doesn't exist. So I think we're going to be seeing some great stuff coming from the world of sound design and sound sculpting that was never possible before.
I love the way you take something that my initial reaction is, I don't like the sounds of this, and make it make it sound exciting. But I was actually I talked to a guy who's with an AI company that is doing things in music, and it was a super interesting conversation, an episode that hasn't come out yet. But I confessed to him, like, a lot of the things surrounding AI and music kind of depressed me, but I was excited though when I talked to him about it. So I can appreciate your enthusiasm. And last question, and if you want, you can rebuttal what I just said. But my last question to you is, what inspires you these days?
Oh my goodness gracious. Isn't it true though that there's so much to be inspired by? There is so much. And I like the things I've always liked. I like books and art and film and television and all forms of art, but specifically musically, the thing that excites me the most these days is the unusual constructions. Sudan Archives and a Canadian band, a brother-sister duo called Like What. Actually, that's the name of their EP. The band name is Tennyson, like Tennnyson. King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. People who are pushing the boundaries of what music is, that appeals to me intellectually. Musically, well, I like what I've always liked. I like my Rolling Stones. I like I like the records that are on the Stax label, and I like my soul stuff, Sly Stone, Al Green, all of that.
You still like Led Zeppelin?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. So now I've got a question for you. So a couple years ago, I was doing an interview, and somebody said, she says, what's going on when you listen to music that you used to like when you were a teenager, and as an adult you listen to it and you don't like it anymore? And that brought my mind to a complete halt, because I've never experienced that. The music I liked when I was young, I still like. So let me ask you, have you experienced that?
As soon as you said it, I started trying to recall something. I mean, I'm sure I could dig something up that maybe I liked a lot more, then than I do now. But now I think for me, it's been kind of the opposite. There were things I hated when I was a kid, like I hated disco, I hated punk. Had a hard time coming into the new wave thing, and I love those things. I grew to love them and appreciate them all. But no, it hasn't. I haven't experienced that.
Yes.
I still dig the things I listened to when I was a kid.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that our taste in music, musical love, it happens through such a complex equation. In the very last chapter of the book, I draw a parallel between falling in love with a record and falling in love with a person. The features that attract you in your romantic partner is just a set of features that for some reason strike you as being necessary and important and just right. And anybody else can look at your beloved and say, yeah, I'm not really sure what you're seeing there. But for you, your beloved can seem absolutely perfect, because they're perfect for you. And it's the same thing with a record that you love. Other people might listen to it and say, yeah, I don't get it. But for you, those elements, not all of them, but there are enough of those elements on that record that you're getting your dopamine, you're getting the response that you want, and that's a perfect match.
I can say that I couldn't see this for a really long time. And I don't know why I pick on these guys. I love them dearly. But over the years, I realized, I had this thought, like, I can see why some people don't like Led Zeppelin. But I love them. I love
Yeah,
them. Yeah.
me too. I know the man who was such a huge influence to me, the producer Tony Berg. I like to call him my mentor because I learned so much from him. He wasn't especially a Prince fan. He never heard in Prince music what many of us hear. I never challenged him on that because Tony Berg loves the Beatles,
Yeah.
and listens for different features than what I listen for. Gets his reward from other things. For me, I got to have that groove there, and I like Keith Richards. I like the Rolling Stones, and I love John Bonham. I love Jimmy Page, and just how his fingers pull sound out of a guitar. For Tony, who's more cerebral than I am, Tony, he prefers something that's a little bit more from the neck up, a little bit more artfully composed, and I'm a little bit more in favor of the performance gestures.
Yes, Led Zeppelin's a little more sexual, aren't they?
They are. They're more they make music from the belly button, and from the hips. I love that.
I'm going to have to remember that. Susan, it was really great talking to you. I was looking forward to it, and you didn't disappoint, and I think it's going to be a great episode.
Well, thank you, Roberto. Thanks for having me on, and good luck with the program.
This episode was powered by Podcast Startup. If you feel you need a little help with that podcast you're contemplating, Podcast Startup may be just the thing for you. Podcast Startup is a program designed for new podcasters. Did you know that most podcasts don't make it past their first few episodes? That's right. They start, they stall, and then they die. Sustaining a podcast ain't easy. It's commitment. A lack of planning and misaligned expectations are a recipe for fast burnout and fade out for podcasters. This is exactly the kind of thing that Podcast Startup was designed to help you with. If you're intrigued, if you want to start a podcast the right way, go to unstarvingmusician.com/podcast startup to learn more and to receive free podcast startup tips from yours truly. Thank you for listening. You can leave us feedback, questions, comments, complaints at unstarvingmusician.com/feedback. If you enjoyed this podcast, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. If you love this podcast, please visit unstarvingmusician.com/crowd-sponsor to learn about the many ways of showing your love and support. Your support does indeed equal love. The series music you heard in this episode is New Gods Part 2 by yours truly. Find links for all the places to hear the full version with vocals by yours truly at robonzo.com. If you do not yet have a website for your music, check out Bandzoogle. It was created to help musicians and bands build their website and manage direct-to-fan marketing and sales. Bandzoogle has amazing design options, a commission-free store to sell music, merch, tickets, and more, plus tools that can capture detailed fan data for you. Try it at bandzoogle.com. Use the promo code ROBONZO, that's ROBONZO, to get 15% off your first year. Find links for all the people and things talked about in this episode at unstarvingmusician.com. Peace, love, and a whole lot of gratitude.